I want a prayer cabinet, something to put in the living room to bring the family together for prayer and devotion and a centralized display of, who we are as Christians, that something that we can use as a family for decades to come. But finding something like what I'm looking for on a furniture store website or something like that is just it's nigh on impossible. So even though I have no idea what I'm doing, I'm gonna try to make my own. Alright, here it is. Behold. I started by scouring Facebook Marketplace for a cabinet that I thought would meet my needs. And there was one particular one that, while it wasn't perfect, I figured if I removed the doors and the lid, it might just do the trick. And as I struggled to remove the lid, this would probably be a good time to explain what I'm even trying to accomplish with this. I want to turn this piece of furniture into a display cabinet where I can put an open Bible, a cross, and maybe some candles. My family is just getting started, and this is our second home we've ever lived in, and so we're building everything from the ground up. And the discussion came up of what did we want more in our living room, a TV or some other kind of display? And my wife and I both agreed that we would much rather have some sort of open Bible display than a TV. I finally got the lid off, but there was another problem. There was all this leftover hardware installed into the desk itself that I just wasn't going to need anymore. At first I wasn't sure if it would come out at all, but the wood was so worn at this point it fell out pretty easy. But at this point, the next problem became pretty clear. The entire dresser was littered with holes and scuff marks and just wasn't looking very pretty. It looked like it was as old as it was, which was decades at least. I had a plan to fill the holes, but I knew that wasn't going to be enough to make the desk look presentable. In addition to this, it was just covered in dust and filth and was just in desperate need of a clean. So I got out the vacuum and gave it as thorough of a rundown as I could. It was at this point I remembered that it wasn't just the visible stuff that needed to be cleaned, but inside the drawers and everything else also needed to be thoroughly gone over. I also got some vinegar and water and gave it a once over, and it was looking pretty shiny at this point, which I was pretty happy about. The next step was to fill in some of these holes. I got this thing from Home Depot called wood putty, which goes on pink and apparently dries a nice wood color. I didn't have the proper tools, but I overfilled it so that I could sand it later. Facebook Marketplace again came to the rescue on this one. I promise this is not sponsored, but it was just really helpful. I got a cheap sander from someone who was getting rid of it, and all I had to do was buy some sandpaper from Home Depot and I was ready to go. Now, according to almighty Google, I was supposed to go over this 3 times, once with 80 grit, and then with 120, and then with 220 grit sandpaper. But when I first started sanding, I didn't realize that I'd accidentally loaded up the wrong type of sandpaper. But I quickly fixed that, and as soon as I started using the correct grit sandpaper, it started coming up pretty quick. This whole process also made me really appreciate just how much work goes into these time lapses. It goes really fast when you're watching it sped up, but in the moment it really does take forever, and my hands felt like they were constantly buzzing whenever I would take a break. When I finally had gone over the entire piece with the 80 grit and the finish was all removed, it was time to go over it again with a finer grit sandpaper. 120 I think was what I used, and I really could feel the difference. The wood felt smoother after I went over it with the 120. I couldn't imagine what it was going to feel like when I went over it with the finest sandpaper. It was also more difficult to tell what I had already done, because with the 80 grit I was removing the stain and I knew exactly what I hadn't accomplished because the stain was still there. But with the finer grit sandpaper, I really just had to keep track of where I was at as best as I could. Once I had finished with the 220 grit, the wood was feeling pretty smooth, and I went over it with a damp cloth to get rid of any sawdust that was left over so the piece would be ready for staining. I can't tell you how long I stood staring at the stain aisle in Home Depot trying to figure out what I was supposed to buy, but eventually I went with the water-based stain and polyurethane in one mixture. But even though it was water-based, they don't call it stain for no reason, so I put down some cardboard to protect the floor from getting stained. I do rent this house and I want to be respectful of the person who owns the house. Once I started applying the stain, this piece of furniture really started to come to life. You can also see in this shot that I applied some trim to the edges of the piece to hide those ugly holes left by the hardware where the door used to be. Once the first coat dried, I went over it again with some super fine, like 400 grit sandpaper, which freaked the heck out of me because it made the whole thing turn white, but I cleaned all that up and then started applying the second coat. I really didn't think it would make that much of a difference, but not only did it cover up the brush strokes from the first coat, but it really just brought out a rich color that wasn't there before. What I'm holding is what the wood looked like before I treated it, and that's the finished product. I think it's a huge improvement. I also did the other accessories like the drawer and the doors. Now it was time to plan out exactly where I wanted everything to go in this desk. So I cut out some pieces of paper that would placehold for where I wanted everything. And the general scheme was looking good, so it was time to order what I wanted and wait for it to come in the mail. Hilariously enough, it was probably the little shelf that I wanted that I was the least satisfied with what I was able to find. However, I found one that looked the right color and was about the right size, so I went ahead and ordered it and installed it, and it looks pretty good. The next thing to arrive in the mail were the prettier accessories, and this company always ships their things with some little pieces of candy, which I always appreciate because I'm a kid at heart. If you look really closely, you can see my toddler trying to get into absolutely everything. Of course, he loved the bubble wrap and thought that was pretty awesome. These were the hooks that I was going to hang the candles and incense burner on, and I think they looked pretty nice. The next thing was the candle. That's what it looks like. It's a nice gold finish, and it's got these crosses cut into it, and then a nice red glass candle. It didn't come with wax like I kind of hoped it would, but that wasn't going to be a problem. And then there were the two angels. Luckily for me, I have tons of candle making equipment lying around, so all I had to do was melt some wax and carefully lower the wick into the little red glass piece. I tied it around a pen and let it dry. Once it had dried, I attempted to cut the string while also holding my phone, but mostly I just made a fool out of myself. I knew I wanted the icons mounted to the back of the dresser itself, but I thought it would look nicer if there was a little bit of physical separation between the wall and the icon, so I made these tiny little blocks to create that separation. The plan was to use a little bit of glue to just keep the block in place, and then once it was in place, I was going to drill through the back of it and then put a screw through the whole thing and let the glue dry. Once the glue had dried, I would pull the screw back out, I would drill yet another pilot hole, but this time into the icon as well, and then reinstall the screws, and hopefully the icon would stay in place. It was definitely more of a struggle than I initially anticipated, and I had to use some creative methods to keep the icons in place, but eventually it went in, and it was looking pretty nice. It was quite the journey to get this to where it is today. But putting in those final pieces, bringing it all together, it really was an emotional moment. Every single item in this prayer cabinet is there for a reason. The angels are hidden partially behind the candle and the incense burner. And this is to remind us that although we may not see the angels, they are nonetheless always around us. The incense burner is next to the angel Gabriel, because the angel Gabriel visited Zechariah while he was burning incense in the temple. The angel Gabriel also visited Daniel while he was praying, and prayer is connected with incense in the Bible. The open Bible is also probably the most important part of this entire display. It's really easy to forget just how many people died or were tortured or suffered all sorts of terrible fates just so that we could have the privilege of displaying a Bible in our homes in a language that we can understand. And then, of course, the candle reminds us that Christ is the light of the world, and thereby we, his disciples, are as well, and the cross brings to mind his sacrifice.